Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on discovering 1031 Exchange. My name is Jeff Stechmann. I'm the Vice President over the Eastern Region for Asset Exchange Company. Before we kind of get started, excuse me, I just want to let everybody know how we're going to handle today's presentation. Don't feel like you have to write every single thing down because today's presentation is actually being recorded, and you'll receive a link to today's recording if you want to refer back to any of the topics that we're going to discuss today. And then some of the topics that we're going to cover, I have in just like a single page PDF form. Excuse me, I'm going to email those out to everyone because I find a lot of times if you're a realtor and you have a client that has a 1031 exchange question or need, boy, you'd love to be able to email them something. And the format that I send the email in, you'll easily be able to pick and choose which PDFs are relevant to your client. If you want to include me on that email that you forward on to your client, that way I can follow up with any questions that may have. That works for you. Hey, it works for me. Obviously, how you want to handle your clients is your prerogative. And then as far as questions go for today's presentation, I'm going to open the floor up to questions at the very end because I do find a lot of times if you have a question, most often it'll be answered in an upcoming slide. All right. But again, at the very end is where we'll open the floor up to questions. So just keep that in mind as we go. And then, today's class is actually worth 2 continuing education hours for Florida realtors. Now, hopefully when you registered, you gave me a Florida real estate license number, including the SL or the BK. If for some reason you did not do that when you registered, please email it over to me. For some reason, sometimes people give me their MLS numbers, but that's not what I need for your Florida real estate license, 2 hours of CE. I need your Florida real estate license number. It's a manual process. I have to take your first and last name along with your Florida license number, including that SL or BK, and I have to upload that up to the state of Florida in order for you to get those 2 hours of continuing education. All right, and also because today's class is worth 2 hours of continuing ed, again, just for Florida realtors, you are going to be required to stay on the line for the entire duration of the class. All right, if for some reason you have to log off early, unfortunately, I'm going to be unable to give you those 2 hours of CE. All right, it's not my requirement. It's the state of Florida. They require that you participate in the entire duration of the class. So just keep that in mind if for some reason you have to log off early. All right, kind of give y'all a little bit of information about myself. So I've actually been in the business this is my 29th year. I did a lot on the closing side of the business to get my start. I'm originally from New Orleans, so if you hear the accent come through, please forgive me. Every now and then it rears its ugly head. But I'm actually based in Florida. I'm in the Tampa Bay area of Florida, and I've lived in Florida for 26 out of those 29 years. And as long as I've been doing this, boy, I've seen the really good times in the real estate industry, and boy, I've seen the really bad times too. So, we'll see what what this year brings to all of us, right? Now, let me give you a little bit of information about who we are. So again, we're Asset Exchange Company. Now, we've actually been in business since 2006. And over the course of our existence, we've done about 40,000 1031 exchanges. All right, it's all that we do. All right, we don't provide any type of financial services. We don't provide any type of closing services. In the industry, we're known as a qualified intermediary, now QI for short. Now, depending on the area of the country that you live in, you may hear people referred to as an accommodator. Another common term is a facilitator, or just simply an intermediary. But again, most often people just refer to as a QI. All right. Now, our main job in a 1031 exchange is we actually hold the proceeds, the net proceeds from what we refer to as the relinquished property. So that's the property that's being sold in a 1031 exchange. Okay, we hold the proceeds from that sale on behalf of the seller, all right, the exchanger, all right, because the rule is they can never actually have receipt of those funds, right? If they ever did, they would lose their ability to do a 1031 exchange. And we're going to talk about that in greater detail in some upcoming slides. But just a word of caution about QIs. It's amazing in today's heavily regulated real estate industry that, at least on a federal level, there actually is no federal agency that oversees what we do. So, what does that mean for everybody out there? Well, what that means is anybody can be a QI. All right, there's no type of requirements you have to have any type of E&O insurance. There's no type of requirements you have to have any type of bond. There's no guidelines on where you hold the proceeds or the type of funds you hold the proceeds in. It's a really scary, scary thought when you sit down and think about it. So, if anybody on the line today is currently involved in a 1031 exchange, please just make sure you've done your due diligence and you're dealing with a reputable company. All right, I'll just leave it at that. All right, now the great news when you deal with us is, we're actually based out of California. Our home office is in San Francisco, but because we're California based, now the state of California actually has a state agency referred to as the California Franchise Tax Board. Now, that Franchise Tax Board actually oversees qualified intermediaries in the state of California. All right, they do require us to carry minimums for the E&O insurance we have, minimums for the bond that we carry. We're subject to audit by that Franchise Tax Board. There's guidelines on the financial institutions where we hold the proceeds. There's guidelines on the type of funds we hold the proceeds in, which is great for anybody that deals with us in California, right? But any file that we work on in any part of the country, because, we handle 1031 exchange throughout the United States, that Franchise Tax Board has oversight in any file that we work on, because as I mentioned, they could come into our office in a moment's notice and audit any file that we work on, not just California property, but in any state that we do business, all right, that we handle 1031 exchanges. So you do have some assurances when you deal with us. Now, as far as our ownership goes, we're actually owned by two gentlemen. Now, they've been in the 1031 exchange business specifically for like 20 plus years, but one of which is actually a tax attorney. All right, now his name is Adam Skarsgård, and Adam is considered like a 1031 exchange expert. He's been called upon to testify in tax court as an expert witness on 1031 exchange. He even occasionally teaches at UC Berkeley on real estate and tax law, that type of thing. Now, the whole reason I like to bring his name up is because, one of the things that we offer that honestly, I don't know if any other QI in the business offers is any of the exchanges that we're involved with. All right, if for some reason they were to get audited, we would actually provide free audit support. All right, we'd work hand in hand with the client's CPA, helping to defend the audit, and it primarily would be done by our tax attorney owner, Adam Skarsgård. All right, so another great reason to deal with us, right? Now, let's talk a little bit about the history of exchanging. So, believe it or not, folks, exchanging has been around for close to 100 years. It really started back in the 20s with farmers. And back in those days, it was pretty simple the way exchanging worked. Maybe I had a farm that I grew corn, and I knew another farmer that he had a farm that he grew wheat. Well, I wanted his farm and he wanted my farm, so we just swapped farms. And it was really that simple back in those days. But our modern day exchange is kind of the the format that we follow today. That was really started back in 1979. And there was a gentleman by the name of T.J. Starker. Now, Mr. Starker lived in California, and he owned all of this land in California with timber on it. All right. And so what Mr. Starker did was he sold that land to a timber company called Crown Zellback. And what Crown Zellback did is, in exchange for the land, they gave him what was referred to as exchange credits, right? And what Mr. Starker did with those exchange credits is, over the course of the next few years, he went out and bought various properties with those exchange credits. And that's really kind of how our modern day exchanges started, again, back in 1979 with T.J. Starker. All right, so if anybody on the line today, if you've ever heard of the term a Starker exchange, that's where it comes from, okay? It comes from T.J. Starker's last name. Now, I deal with some CPAs, that have been in the business for, 40, 50 years, whatever it may be. They still refer to a 1031 exchange as a Starker exchange, all right? So again, if you ever hear that term pop up, that's where it comes from. It comes from T.J. Starker's last name, all right? Now, we talk about 1031 tax-deferred exchange. That name is actually derived from Internal Revenue Code, Section 1031, all right? And the code states this: No gain or loss shall be recognized on the exchange of real property held for productive use in a trade or business or for investment, if such real property is exchanged solely for real property of like kind, which is to be held either for productive use in a trade or business or for investment. Now, I know, I get it. That's kind of a mouthful, right? Well, the code states that property held for productive use in a trade or business, right? So you can do a 1031 exchange on any type of real property that you use in your trade or business, right? I'll give you guys an example of maybe the way that could work. So we did an exchange for a gentleman. Now, he owned a daycare center, all right? So he was using that real property for his business. So what he did was he sells it in a 1031 exchange. Now, in his case, the property that he bought as his replacement property, he went out and purchased another daycare center. Because why? Because he was going to use that property for his business. Okay, so any type of real property that you use in your trade or business, you can sell it in a 1031 exchange, and you can buy as a replacement any type of real property that you use in your trade or business. All right, now the next part of the code where it states for investment. So for investment, that could be something as simple as, let's say you own a single family residential home, right? And you hold it for investment. Well, how do you hold it for investment? It's a rental property, right? So you can take that rental property, you could sell that in a 1031 exchange, and then what can you buy as your replacement? Well, that's the next part of the code, like-kind property. All right, so what exactly is like-kind property, right? Well, like-kind property is any type of real property that you use in your trade or business or that you hold for investment. You can sell that in a 1031 exchange, and you can buy as a replacement any type of like-kind property, which is either property that you use in your trade or business or that you hold for investment. All right, so just because you're selling that single family residential home that you hold for investment, right, that rental property, when you sell that in a 1031 exchange, you don't have to buy as a replacement another single family residential home if you don't want to, right? You can by all means if you do want to, but you could even buy as a replacement a townhome, a condo, a duplex, a fourplex, vacant land. I mean, you could go out and buy a commercial piece of property, a commercial strip shopping center. You could go out and buy a downtown commercial office building. All right, one of the high rises is in any major metropolitan area in the United States. All right, it doesn't matter if it's residential property or commercial property. Everything is interchangeable with 1031 exchange. I mean, you could be selling property that you use in your trade or business, and you could buy as a replacement investment property. Okay, that's also interchangeable, right? And you're not even limited where you can buy and sell property. Right? You can buy and sell real property anywhere in the United States, including Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, or the Mariana Islands. Now, sometimes people will ask me, they say, well, Jeff, what about property in Puerto Rico? Can I use that in a 1031 exchange? And unfortunately, the answer is no, right? The reason being is Puerto Rico is under a different tax structure than we are here in the States. And that's why property in Puerto Rico is excluded from 1031 exchange. All right, now, if you've ever heard of the term a like-kind exchange, that's where it comes from. It comes from the part of the code that talks about like-kind property. Now, I know we have a bunch of Florida realtors on the line today. Okay, now the standard real estate contract that Florida realtors use, they refer to it as the FAR contract. Okay, in that FAR contract, there's already 1031 exchange language built into it. All right, it's in section 18 and it's item N. All right, now the language in the FAR contract actually refers to a 1031 exchange as a like-kind exchange. So again, if you ever hear that term pop up, that's where it comes from. It comes from the part of the code that talks about like-kind property, okay? Now, why do investors exchange? Well, the single most obvious reason that we see is for tax deferral. All right, so typically when you sell real property, if you have a gain in the property, on average, okay, on average, about a third of whatever that gain is goes towards paying taxes. And that's the single most reason that we see investors utilizing 1031 exchange is to defer those taxes. All right, but what are some of the other things that we see or reasons why investors utilize 1031 exchange? Well, the next bullet item, I call it buy more property. So with exchanging, okay, you're not even one of the requirements to 1031 exchange is the replacement property that you purchase in a 1031 exchange, okay, that purchase price must be at least equal to, or it can even be greater than, whatever the sales price was on the property that you sold, the relinquished property. All right. So what an investor will do is by utilizing a 1031 exchange, the tax savings that they realize in a 1031 exchange, they use that as leverage to go out and buy themselves a better property. All right. Now, hopefully, it's going to be a higher dollar property for them. Also, hopefully, that's going to equate to a higher income producing property for them. Because, if you just think about it, if no longer do they have to cut that check for whatever the taxes were going to be, right? Just gives them that much more buying power to go out there and buy a better property, right? Again, hopefully it's going to be a higher dollar property for them. Hopefully also it's going to equate to a higher income producing property for them, all by utilizing the tax savings of a 1031 exchange, right? Now, something else that we see, or reasons we see investors utilizing 1031 exchange is for diversification and management relief, right? With exchanging, you're not even limited to how many properties you can sell in an exchange. You're not even limited to how many properties you can purchase in a 1031 exchange, right? You could sell one property, buy one replacement property. Now, you could even sell one property and buy multiple replacement properties, or you could sell multiple properties and buy a single property or buy multiple properties. It doesn't matter, right? What matters, I'll say it again. In 1031 exchange, it must be real property that either you're using your trade or business or you hold for investment, and you have to buy replacement property that either you're using your business or that you hold for investment. All right, so geographic diversification is something that we see investors utilizing 1031 exchange for. I'll give you guys an example of maybe the way that could work. So let's say I own an investment property. I don't know, maybe I own it in a state like California. Now, California has some of the highest property values in the entire country. I want to say like where our home office is in San Francisco, I want to say the average sales price for property in San Francisco has now actually exceeded the average sales price for property located in New York City. All right, so you own that investment property in California. Now, you sell it in a 1031 exchange, right? But instead of buying a replacement property in California, you say, you know what? Maybe I'll buy one replacement property, let's say here in Florida where I'm located. And I don't know, maybe you'll buy an additional replacement property, maybe in another state. I don't know, maybe like Texas. And if you have enough, who knows? Maybe you can buy an additional replacement property. I don't know, maybe in a state, maybe like Ohio. Because why? Because you don't want to be so geographically tied in to one particular real estate market, because, hey, who knows? If our market here in Florida starts to go down again, well, at least you have that other property in Texas and that additional property in Ohio, right? Hopefully those real estate markets would not be experiencing the same downturn that we would be experiencing here in Florida. All right. Now, management relief is something else that we see investors utilizing 1031 exchange for. I'll give you guys another example, maybe of the way that could work. So I have a client, right? He lives in New York. Now he owns 4 rental properties in New York. He'd love to be able to retire. He wants to move here to Florida and he wants to retire. Now his ultimate goal is he'd like to be able to sell all 4 of those rental properties in one 1031 exchange. And then the replacement property that he purchases, well, he'd like to find maybe like a small apartment complex somewhere here in Florida that has some on-site management. Because why? Because he wants to retire and he doesn't want to manage property anymore. Basically, he wants to sit back. He wants to collect a check every month. 1031 exchange is perfect for somebody like him because he seeks that management relief. All right. Now, another thing that we see investors utilizing 1031 exchange for is they actually will utilize 1031 exchange as an estate planning tool. Now, this is really a great aspect of 1031 exchange that honestly, it doesn't really get talked about that often. And hey, if you only remember one thing from today's class, hopefully you remember this next point, all right? With 1031 exchange, you're not even limited to how many times you can do an exchange. I mean, I could buy an investment property today, hold on to it for a period of years. When I go to sell it, do a 1031 exchange, defer my taxes, buy a replacement investment property. Now, I could hold on to that property for a period of years. When I go to sell that property, I can do another 1031 exchange, defer my taxes again, and buy another replacement investment property. I mean, I can keep doing that over and over and over throughout the entire course of my lifetime. Okay, now when I die, when I pass on, if I have any heirs that inherit my property, my heirs are going to get a benefit that's referred to as a step up in basis. And basically, what that means is whatever the value of the property is, when they inherit the property, that's their basis, that's their starting point. All of those deferrals that would have been done from whoever they inherit the property from, they're not responsible for paying the taxes. And actually, no one is, and the taxes go away. All right. Now, what's the flip side of that equation? Well, I just mentioned you're not limited to how many times you could do a 1031 exchange, right? Buy an investment property today, hold on to it for a period of years, sell it in a 1031 exchange, right? Defer your taxes, buy a replacement investment property. Hey, hold on to that for a period of years, right? Sell that in a 1031 exchange, defer your taxes again, buy another replacement investment property. Now, let's just say the next time I go to sell, I say, you know what? I have no desire to purchase another investment property. I have no desire to do any type of 1031 exchange. I'm just going to cash out and I'll pay whatever the taxes are. Well, you're going to be subject to whatever the taxes are on that transaction. And all those previous 1031 exchanges where you deferred your taxes, you could also possibly be subject to having to pay those taxes as well. Because notice how we term 1031 exchange as a tax deferral. Deferral meaning that if you do not continue to do 1031 exchanges, you're going to be subject to whatever the taxes are. But remember the step up in basis, right? If you have heirs that inherit your property, they're going to get that step up in basis. They're not responsible for paying the taxes. And hopefully no one ever has to pay the taxes. All right. So again, hopefully everybody remembers that point about the step up in basis from today's class, because, you know, like I said, it doesn't really get talked about that often, but it's a really great aspect of 1031 exchange. Here's a quick example of how the step up in basis could work. All right, let's say I'm the heir. I inherit the property, I get the step up in basis, I'm not responsible for paying the taxes go away. Now, I might look at that property that I just inherited and say, you know what? It's a great property. I'm not going to sell it for my own investment purposes. I'm going to hold on to it, right? Because, you know, it's a rental property, right? Maybe it has some nice cash flow coming in every month from rent. I say, okay, I'm going to hold on to it for my own investment purposes. Now, let's just say I hold on to that property, I don't know, maybe like 5 years, right? And then after 5 years, I say, okay, now I'm ready to sell it. Now, if I have any gain from when I got that step up in basis to when I inherited the property to when I go to sell it 5 years later, guess what? I can do my own 1031 exchange, defer my taxes, and basically start the entire process all over again. So again, hopefully everybody remembers the step up in basis and utilizing 1031 exchange as an estate planning tool. Okay. Now, what are current tax rates? So when you sell real property, okay, if you have any gain in the property, you're going to be subject to capital gains tax. Now, capital gains tax right now is either 15% or 20%. Now, the 15% capital gains tax rate is applied if you're single and you have income of less than $519,000 a year, or if you're married and you have income of less than $584,000 a year. All right, that's where you're at, the 15% capital gains tax rate. Now, the 20% capital gains tax rate is applied if you're single and you have income of greater than $519,000 a year, or if you're married and you have income of greater than $584,000 a year, right? That's where you're at the 20% capital gains tax rate. Now, in addition to the capital gains tax rate, you'd also be subject to another tax. It's referred to as depreciation recapture tax, right? That's an additional 25% tax. Now, you might be asking yourself, how does that work? What's that all about, right? Well, the depreciation recapture tax works like this. Any depreciation that you've claimed in the property, for the lifetime that you've owned that property, when you go to sell that property, they're going to hit you with a 25% depreciation recapture tax on the entire amount of depreciation that you've claimed for the lifetime that you've owned that property. Okay, now, on top of that tax, you may also be subject to an additional tax. It's referred to as the Medicare tax. Now, another term you hear people refer to it is the NIT tax, the net investment income tax, all right? That's an additional 3.8% tax. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is that all about? How does that work? Well, the Medicare tax It's something that they passed back in 2010 with the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. It actually went into effect in 2013. It was one of the things that they offset, that they passed to try to offset some of the cost of the Affordable Care Act. Right. The great news is when you do a 1031 exchange, you can defer having to pay any of these taxes. All right. Now, what am I not listing on the slide? I'm not listing anything to do with state taxes. Now, for those of y'all that are located in a state like I'm located in Florida, we don't have any type of state taxes, so we don't even need to worry about that. But if you live in a state or you're selling property that is located in a state that has state taxes, you'd also have to be able to calculate whatever those numbers are. Great news again is when you do a 1031 exchange, you can also avoid having to pay those state taxes. Now, every state has their kind of has their own way of you completing some type of form or going through some type of process in order to get out of having to pay those state taxes. All right, I'll give you guys a couple of examples, at least on exchanges that I was personally involved with. So we did an exchange for a gentleman. Now, he was a Florida resident, but he owned an investment property in California. Now, California has state taxes, and I want to say their state taxes can be like, I want to say they can be as high as like 11 or 12%. It's kind of like a tiered level. It's like the more you make, the more they tax you. All right. Now, even though he was a Florida resident, but he was selling a property located in California, guess what? California was still looking for their state taxes. Now, the good news for him was he was doing a 1031 exchange with us. He was going to be able to get out of having to pay those state of California taxes. And basically, the way he got out of them was he had to submit this, he had to complete the state of California form, submit it to the state. That's how he got out of it. All right. But it's my understanding that he's got to submit that form every year thereafter. All right. The year he doesn't submit the form, they actually come after him for the taxes. All right. Now, we did another exchange for a lady. She was another Florida resident. I believe she was selling property located in Maryland. All right. Now, Maryland has state taxes. Again, good news for her was she was doing a 1031 exchange with us. She was going to be able to get out of having to pay those state of Maryland taxes. And what she had to do is she had to complete the state of Maryland form. I think we even had to sign off on it. And I want to say she had to submit it to the state like 20 days prior to closing. That's how she got out of it. All right. So again, every state kind of has their own way of you completing some type of form or going through some type of process in order to get out of having to pay those state taxes. All right. Now, I know we have a bunch of realtors on the line today. All right. Y'all think about this for a minute. If that's your client, and you know that they're selling an investment property and they're not talking about doing a 1031 exchange, especially if the property is located in a state that has state taxes, that's a perfect opportunity for you to bring it up, right? Because if you can show to them, say, look, avoid having to cut that check or those checks, right? Again, if they're subject to state taxes, it's just going to give them that much more buying power, right? To go out there and buy a better property. Now, hey, hopefully it's going to be a higher dollar property for them. Also, hopefully that's going to equate to a higher income producing property for them, okay? And if they can do that, if they can buy that higher dollar property, as far as you being a realtor, how is that going to affect your commission? Hopefully you just increase your commission, all by recommending a 1031 exchange, right? So again, hopefully some things to think about for everybody on the line today. All right, let's see. All right, so how do you actually calculate what the taxes are? Well, this is typically done by a CPA, all right, but I'm going to walk you through just a real basic example, just to kind of give you an idea how they calculate taxes and what potential taxes could be. All right, so in our example, we originally purchased our property for $500,000. Right now, over the lifetime that we own the property, we added back into it $25,000 worth of capital improvements to it. Now, we took some depreciation, okay, for the lifetime that we owned the property, we took $100,000 worth of depreciation, okay? And now we've decided we're going to sell the property. We're going to sell it for $1 million, okay? So in order to calculate what the taxes are, the first thing you need to be able to do is you have to be able to calculate what they refer to as adjusted basis, right? Basically, the way you do that is you take the original purchase price of $500,000. Now you add back in those capital improvements of $25,000, and then you deduct out the depreciation of $100,000, right? And that's going to give you an adjusted basis of $425,000, right? Now, how much are we selling it for? We're selling it for $1 million, right? So let's take that $1 million sales price. We'll deduct out the adjusted basis of $425,000. That's actually going to give us a gain of $575,000. Now, within that number, how much of that is depreciation? $100,000, right? So you remember the depreciation recapture tax that we just talked about, that 25% tax? That's actually calculated at a separate line item, right? So we'll take out the $100,000, multiply that times the 25% depreciation recapture tax. That's going to give us a tax of $25,000. Now, how much do we have left over? $475,000. Now, let's just say we're going to be at the highest capital gains tax rate of 20%. All right, so we'll take the $475,000, multiply it times the 20% capital gains tax rate. That's going to give us a tax of $95,000. Now, let's also say we're going to be subject to that Medicare tax of 3.8%. Okay, so let's take the $475,000, multiply it times the 3.8% Medicare tax. That's going to give us a tax of $18,050. Right? So when we sell this property, we would be looking at a tax bill of $138,050. The great news, again, is when you do a 1031 exchange, you can defer having to pay any of these taxes. Now, remember, everybody, what am I not listing up in the slide? I'm not listing anything to do with state taxes, right? So again, if you live in a state or if you're selling property that is located in a state that has state taxes, you'd also have to calculate wherever those numbers are. Again, right? Remember, realtors, think about it. If that's your client, right, and they're sitting there thinking they're going to have to cut a check for $138,050, and then whatever's left over, hey, now let's go find me some replacement property, right? If you bring it to their attention, you say, look, avoid having to cut that check or those checks, right? Do a 1031 exchange. Now let's go out and find you something even better. You know, that's win-win all around, right? I mean, the client wins, obviously, because, hey, they're going to save on the taxes. And if they can save on the taxes, it just gives them that much more buying power to go out there and buy themselves a better property. And again, hopefully it's going to be a higher dollar property for them. Also, hopefully that's going to equate to a higher income producing property for them. And you win as a realtor because why? Well, you look great to the client, right? You're helping them save on all the taxes. And if they can buy that higher dollar property, hopefully you just increase your commission, all by recommending a 1031 exchange. So again, hopefully some things to think about for everybody on the line today, okay? Now, what are some of the tax advantages when you sell real property? So let's recap, right? For 1031 exchange, what type of real property can you use in a 1031 exchange? Any type of real property that you use in your trade or business or that you hold for investment, right? And remember, it's a tax deferral, it's not a tax avoidance, folks. If you do not continue to do 1031 exchanges, you're going to be subject to whatever the taxes are. But remember the step up in basis, right? If you have any heirs that inherit your property, they're going to get that step up in basis. They're not responsible for paying the taxes. So hopefully no one will ever have to pay the taxes. Now, what about your primary home, your primary residence? Can you do a 1031 exchange in your primary? Well, the answer is no. Now, the good news is, which you may qualify for your primary residence, you may qualify for what they refer to as a Section 121, all right? And in order to qualify for the 121, you had to have lived in that property as your primary home, your primary residence, any 2 out of the last 5 years, all right? And if you do qualify, when you sell your primary home, if you have any gain and you're single, the first $250,000 of any gain is tax exempt. And if you're married, the first $500,000 of any gain is tax exempt. Now, tax exempt meaning that you never have to pay it. It's not like some type of tax deferral like a 1031 exchange. It's a true tax exemption, all right? It's kind of like a one and done. Now, you don't need anybody like me to help you with the 121. That's just something that you claim on your tax return in the year that you sell your primary residence. Here's an example, maybe the way the Section 121 can work. So let's just say back in 2010, we go out, we purchase our primary home. All right. Now we buy it for $100,000. Okay. Now we're going to live in it as our primary home, primary residence for 5+ years. And then in 2016, we say, okay, we're going to sell it. We're going to sell it for $1 million. Now I know everybody, that was a pretty good deal, right? I don't know if there's any deals like that anywhere here in the Tampa Bay area where I live. But I don't know, maybe this is property in California or maybe New York, all right? But just for our example, we'll keep the numbers really simple, all right? So we're selling it for $1 million, right? We purchased it for $100,000. All right, so our gain is $900,000. Now I know that's not exactly how you calculate it, right? Because you got to figure out adjusted basis and everything else we talked about a few slides ago. But again, just for this example, we'll keep it really simple. All right, so we have a $900,000 gain. Now it qualifies for 121 because actually in this example, we've actually lived in it greater than 2 out of the last 5 years as our primary residence. Okay, now let's also say when we sell it in 2016, we're married. Okay, now we're going to claim the 121. So because we're married, the first 500,000 of that $900,000 gain, that'll be tax exempt, right? But what's the problem? Well, we still have another $400,000 worth of gain that we're going to be subject to taxes on when we sell the property in 2016, right? That's going to equate to roughly about $130,000 in taxes when we sell the property in 2016. Now, hey, what if we could do this? What if instead of selling the property in 2016, we actually had the ability to convert it to an investment property? We make it a rental property. All right, let's say we do that. Let's say we rent it out for 2 years. And then in 2018, we say, okay, now we're ready to sell it. We'll keep the numbers all the same. We're still going to sell it for $1 million. We're still married in 2018 when we sell it. But because now when we're selling it in 2018, it's an investment property. Guess what? It qualifies for 1031 tax deferred exchange. And in this example, it actually qualifies for both. We can do a combination of a 121 and a 1031. Again, for the 121, just look back. Did you live in it any 2 out of the last 5 years of your primary residence? In this case, we did. All right. So what we're going to do, we're going to claim the 121 again. And again, because we're married, the first 500,000 of that $900,000 gain will be tax exempt. Now that additional $400,000 worth of gain that we were subject to taxes on in 2016 when we were selling it, again, because in 2018 it's an investment property, we're going to claim a 1031 tax deferred exchange on that portion of the gain, the $400,000. We're going to defer those taxes. So when we sell the property in 2018, we pay no tax. Okay, here's another way you can do it. Let's say you want to go out and you want to buy a fourplex. Let's say you want to live in one of the units as your primary residence, but the other 3 units, you're going to rent those out. That's going to be the investment portion. It's the same thing. When you go to sell that fourplex, did you live in it any 2 out of the last 5 years as your primary residence? If you did, to keep the numbers really simple, you claim the section 121 on 1/4 of the gain, the portion that you lived in it as your primary residence, and those other 3 units, that was the investment portion, 3/4 of the gain, you claim a 1031 tax deferred exchange, you defer those taxes, so you pay no tax when you sell it. This could also work if you want to go out and buy, let's say a duplex, a double, right? You want to live in half of it, excuse me, as your primary residence. The other half you want to rent out. It's the same thing. Again, to keep the numbers simple, did you live in it any 2 out of the last 5 years as your primary residence? If you did, on half of the gain, you claim the 121. That portion will be tax exempt. The other half, that was the rental side, right? You claim section 1031 on that portion of the gain. You defer those taxes. So when you sell that duplex, you pay no tax. Okay. Now, I get this question a lot. People will ask me, they say, well, Jeff, how long do I need to hold on to a property for it to be considered an investment property? And the honest answer is, I really just don't know, all right? Because there's nowhere in the code that states how long you need to own a property for it to be considered an investment property. All right? The code just states it must be real property that you use in your trade or business or that you hold for investment. All right. Now, if you ask some CPAs, they'll tell you, excuse me, good rule of thumb is you really need to hold on to the property for at least a year, for 12 months, all right? And really to rent it out for 12 months, because if you just think about the logic behind that, let's say you buy a property today, right? It's 2024, right? Now, you're going to rent it out for a year. So what is that going to mean? What that's going to mean is you're going to claim that property as an investment property on your 2024 tax return, right? Any income that's coming in from rent, any expenses that are going out, that all will all be reported on your 2024 tax return. Now remember, you're renting it out for a year, for 12 months, right? That's going to carry you over to next year, 2025, right? What is that going to mean? That's going to mean you're also going to claim that property as an investment property on your 2025 tax returns, right? Any income that's coming in from rent, any expenses that are going out, right? So over 2 tax filing years, you would be showing to the IRS that that property is an investment property, right? Is that a good rule of thumb? Well, the answer is maybe, right? Because if you have some other CPAs, they'll tell you, no, really a good rule of thumb is you really need to hold on to the property for at least 2 years, for 24 months. And if you just think about the logic behind that, well, I'll step back for a minute. The reason being is, one of the reasons is back in 2008, okay, the IRS came out with guidelines regarding vacation homes, right? And in the guidelines for vacation homes, the IRS stated for a vacation home to be considered an investment property, you must own that property for at least 2 years or 24 months, right? So some CPAs pick up on that and they say, all right, well, for vacation homes, the IRS actually is giving us guidelines stating for that vacation home to be considered an investment property, you must own it for at least 2 years or 24 months. Therefore, they're of the opinion, okay, of any type of investment property, a good rule of thumb is to really hold on to them for at least 2 years or 24 months, right? But the reality of the whole thing is, it's not going to be so much about how long you own the property. It's going to be more so about your intent, all right? And your intent could be something like this. Did you advertise the property for rent? Now, did you advertise it for fair market value rent? You know, if fair market value rent is, let's just say, I don't know, $1,500 a month, and you're actually advertising it for rent for like $5,000 a month, yeah, you know what? The IRS is probably going to have an issue with that. If you get audited and the IRS comes in and says, okay, prove to us you held that property for investment, you're going to have to be able to back it up, folks, all right? Now, I list one particular court case on the slide, all right? It's referred to as Resnick versus the commissioner. Now, in that particular court case, all right, the circumstances was you had a husband and wife, all right? They owned a single family residential home. Now, that was their primary home, okay? But they also owned another single family residential home that was an investment property, a rental property, right? So what they did was they sell the rental property in a 1031 exchange, okay? Now, the replacement property that they purchased, in their case, they went out and purchased another single family residential home. That was going to be the replacement investment property, okay? Now, during the 6-month period after they did their 1031 exchange, they actually ran a classified ad in the town newspaper that they lived in, advertising that property for rent at fair market value, okay? Now, they even showed it to 2 potential renters during that 6-month period, but for whatever reason, they could never get the property rented out, all right? Now, what else happened during that 6-month period was one of them loses their job, right? So they had a mortgage in their primary home. They also had a mortgage on that investment property, but what? It wasn't rented out, right? So after 8 months of ownership, they wound up selling their primary home and they moved into the investment property. In that particular court case, it was ruled that their intent was to hold the property for investment, all right? But what happened? The circumstances changed, right? And they were forced to do something, all right? So again, it's not always going to be about how long you own the property. It's going to be more so about your intent. And as I mentioned, if you ever get audited, you're going to have to be able to back it up. All right, so please, everybody, just remember investment intent, okay? Now, vacation homes. Boy, I always like to talk about vacation homes because I live in Florida, right? And here in Florida, it seems like either everybody has a vacation home or everybody wants a vacation home, all right? So how does that vacation home qualify as an investment property. All right, this is actually referred to as Revenue Procedure 2008-16. And the first guideline I've already given you guys. You must own the property for a minimum of 2 years or 24 months. All right, now, for every 12-month period of ownership, you must rent that property out for a minimum of 14 days at fair market value. Now, you can use it for some personal use, okay? For every 12-month period of ownership, you can actually use the property for 14 days personal use, or 10% of the total time that you had it rented during that 12-month period. Here's a quick example of maybe the way that could work. Let's just say you rent that property out during that 12-month period. I don't know, let's say you rent it out for 200 days, okay? So 10% of 200 would be what? Would be 20, right? So you could use it for 20 days personal use instead of the 14 days, right? If that property meets those guidelines, it qualifies as an investment property, and hey, you can use it in a 1031 exchange. Now, if it doesn't meet those guidelines, I wouldn't necessarily say it would be disqualified. In that particular situation, I'd recommend to the client, I'd say, look, talk to your CPA. And if you and your CPA can come to an agreement where you feel like you can justify that property as being an investment property, then hey, by all means, use it in a 1031 exchange, all right? We're always going to recommend to people, talk to your CPA. Because why? Because your CPA is going to have way more information about your tax situation than I ever would, that I would even care to ever know, all right? If the CPA comes back and says, yeah, I feel like we can justify that property as being an investment property, then hey, use it in a 1031 exchange, all right? Remember I told you all in the very beginning, before we kind of dove in today, some of the topics that we're going to cover today, I have in just like PDF form. I have one that just talks about vacation homes, all right? Again, I'm going to be emailing those out to everybody, so be on the lookout for that email after we wrap up today's class, okay? Now, who can actually do a 1031 exchange? So, excuse me, it's really important to remember with 1031 exchange, whoever the taxpayer is in the sale of the relinquished property, okay, that's the property that's being sold in a 1031 exchange, whoever that taxpayer is always needs to be the same taxpayer in the purchase of any replacement property or properties, all right? So individuals can do 1031 exchanges. Husband and wives can do 1031 exchanges. Spouses can do 1031 exchanges. Sometimes they see this with spouses. Let's just say one of the parties owns an investment property prior to being married. All right, let's just say it's the wife. She owns an investment property, or a rental property, right? All right, prior to being married. Now, she gets married, and then during the course of the marriage, at some point, she decides she wants to sell that investment property. All right, now she wants to do a 1031 exchange because she wants to defer the taxes, and she really would like to be able to go out and buy a replacement investment property. Now, in order to buy the replacement investment property, she needs to get a loan, a mortgage, right? In order to qualify for the loan, well, she has to bring her husband in because she needs his income to help her qualify for the loan. So how can you do that with 1031 exchange? Well, one possible solution would be you might be able to take title to the replacement property as what's referred to as tenants in common ownership. All right, hopefully everybody knows what tenants in common ownership is, but if you don't, it's pretty simple. You can actually own a certain percentage of a property. Now, in order for any of this to work, you obviously would have to get the lender's approval, right? But what you might be able to do, you might be able to bring the wife in, you make her a 99% tenant in common owner of the replacement property, and hey, bring the husband in, make him a 1% tenant in common owner of the replacement property. Again, if the lender would go for those terms, you get the loan approved, you could buy the replacement investment property, all right? That brings me to the next point. Tenant in common owners can also do 1031 exchanges. I'll give you guys a quick example, maybe the way that could work. Let's just say I want to go out and I want to buy an investment property, but I want to bring somebody else in with me to help me buy it, all right? And we're gonna take title to the property as tenant in common owners, where I'm gonna own 50% of it, and he's gonna own 50% of it, right? So we buy this investment property, 50-50, tenant in common owners. We hold on to it for a period of years. At some point, we say, okay, we're ready to sell it. Now, for me, I'd like to take my 50% tenant in common ownership because, hey, I want to do a 1031 exchange. I want to defer my taxes, and I really would love to be able to go out and buy a replacement investment property. Now, my other tenant in common owner, he says, you know what? I have no desire to purchase any additional investment properties. I have no desire to do any type of 1031 exchange. I'm fine with just cashing out. I'll pay whatever the taxes are. He has the option to do that. Just like me, I have the option to take my 50%, defer my taxes, do a 1031 exchange, buy a replacement investment property. Now, if he wanted to, he could take his 50% tenant in common ownership. He could do his own 1031 exchange, and he could go out and buy his own replacement investment property. Okay, so again, tenant in common owners can do 1031 exchanges. Any type of legal entity that owns real property can do a 1031 exchange, all right? Corporations, trust, partnerships, LLCs, all of those types of entities can do 1031 exchanges. Sometimes we see this with LLCs. Sometimes for tax purposes, the LLC is set up as what they refer to as a disregarded entity. Now, disregarded meaning that you don't file a separate tax return for that LLC. Anything to do with that LLC, you just put on your personal taxes. It's common that we see this with like single member LLCs, okay? Some of y'all on the line today, you might have an LLC that you have set up for your real estate business. You know, what do you do at the end of the year? You don't file a separate tax return for that LLC, right? Anything to do with that LLC, you just put on your personal taxes, okay? So again, that's referred to as a disregarded entity because that entity and you as an individual, at least for tax purposes, are considered one and the same because it's all being reported on the same tax return. All right, so sometimes we see this. Somebody will own an investment property in their individual name. They do a 1031 exchange. They actually have the option to purchase their replacement investment property in their individual name, or they could even purchase it in their disregarded entity, that disregarded LLC, all right? Works just the opposite way too. Sometimes we see people that will own an investment property in their disregarded LLC, all right? They sell it in a 1031 exchange. They actually have the option to purchase it in the name of that LLC, or they could even purchase it in their individual names, right? Sometimes we see that happening, having to purchase property in their individual names because, you know, especially if they're trying to get a loan, you know, a lot of banks, mortgage companies, lenders, they don't like loaning to LLCs. They like loaning to individuals. So sometimes that forces people to have to purchase replacement property in their individual names, but it can be done, all right? Sometimes we even see this, and some of y'all on the line, you may have seen this at some point in your real estate career. Somebody wants to go out, they want to buy an investment property, right? The investment property is located on 1234 Main Street. Okay, so what do? They go out and create 1234 Main Street LLC. That's going to be what? It's going to be a disregarded entity, meaning what? They're not going to file a separate tax return for 1234 Main Street LLC, right? Anything to do with 1234 Main Street LLC, they're just going to put in their personal taxes, all right? So they buy 1234 Main Street in the name of 1234 Main Street LLC. It's an investment property. They hold on to it for a period of years. They sell it in a 1031 exchange, right? The replacement property that they're going to buy is located on 5678 Central Avenue, right? So guess what? They don't want 1234 Main Street LLC purchasing 5678 Central Avenue. So what do in that case? They go out and create 5678 Central Avenue LLC that is also going to be what? A disregarded entity, meaning what? They're not going to file a separate tax return for that LLC. Anything to do with that LLC, they also are going to put on their personal taxes. You can do that with 1031 exchange because all those disregarded entities are considered one and the same with each other, and they're also considered one and the same with the individual because why? Because it's all being reported on the same tax return. All right, so remember, at the first point I made when we started talking about this slide, always remember with 1031 exchange, whoever the taxpayer is in the sale of the relinquished property always needs to be the same taxpayer in the purchase of any replacement property or properties, right? If the actual entity files a separate tax return, a regarded entity, maybe it's a partnership, multi-member partnership, a corporation, if that entity files a separate tax return, okay, that entity is going to be the seller in the 1031 exchange, and that same entity needs to be the purchaser in any replacement property or properties, right? Because again, taxpayer in the sale always needs to be the same taxpayer in the purchase of any replacement property or properties when you do a 1031 exchange, all right? Sometimes we see this with partnerships. Sometimes when a partnership owns an investment property, sometimes when the partnership is ready to sell the investment property, individual partners may have different ideas of what they think the partnership should do when they sell that investment property. You might have one partner that says, you know what, I think our partnership should do a 1031 exchange to defer its taxes. I think the partnership should go out and buy a replacement investment property. But you might have another partner that says, you know what, I don't think our partnership should do any type of 1031 exchange. I don't think our partnership should purchase any replacement properties. I think the partnership should just cash out, pay whatever the taxes are. Well, how can you satisfy all the partners' needs, wants, whatever it may be? Here's two solutions, all right? Now, these are actual terms that we refer to in the industry. I kid you not, right? The first one, it's actually referred to as a drop and swap, all right? And the drop and swap can work something like this. Let's say we have a multi-member partnership. I don't know, let's say we have 3 partners in the partnership, right? The partnership owns an investment property, okay? Now, what happens with the drop portion of the drop and swap, the actual partnership itself will be dissolved, will be dropped, okay? And what they do is they change the ownership structure in the investment property to tenants in common, right? They drop the partnership, they change the tenant, the ownership interest in that property to tenants in common. And what did we say? We had 3 partners, right? So each one of those former partners become a 1/3 tenant in common owner in that real property, that investment property. All right. Now, as tenant in common owners, they're going to have to hold on to that property probably for a year or two. Because why? Because they need to show that their intent as tenant in common owners is to hold the property as an investment. Now, after the year or two passes, then they can do the swap. Then they can sell the property, and then each tenant in common owner can do what they want. Hey, one wants to take their 1/3, do a 1031 exchange, defer their taxes, buy a replacement investment property, they can do that. One of the other 1/3 tenant in common owners says, hey, I don't want to do any type of 1031 exchange. I don't want to pay, I don't want to purchase any replacement investment property. They can cash out, pay whatever the taxes are. All right. Now, the opposite of a drop and swap is what's referred to as a swap and drop. All right. Again, let's say we have that multi-member partnership, right? We have 3 members in the partnership, owns the real property, the investment property, right? So the swap portion works like this. The actual partnership itself will do a 1031 exchange, okay? Now, the replacement property that the partnership purchases, instead of going out and buying 1 replacement property, the partnership will actually go out and buy 3 replacement properties. Now, why 3? Because we have 3 partners. And the thinking is each partner is going to have a say in which properties the partnership purchases, right? So the partnership purchases 3 replacement properties. Now, once the partnership purchases those 3 replacement properties, the partnership itself is going to have to hold on to those 3 replacement properties probably for a year or two. Because why? Because the partnership needs to show that its intent is to hold those properties as an investment. And after the year or two passes, then they can do the drop. Then they can dissolve the partnership, and then each former partner will get one of those properties, right? What's the common thread in each one of these scenarios? It's going to take some time, right? It's going to take a year or two before everything is over and done with. The partners need to have some type of agreement that they're willing to deal with each other for the next year or two. You know, unfortunately, sometimes with partnerships, the whole reason they're looking to sell is they're not getting along anymore. They want to get away from each other. So again, they have to have some type of agreement that they're willing to at least deal with each other for the next year or two. If they can't come to any type of agreement like that, unfortunately, probably neither one of these scenarios are going to work for them, okay? Now, I get this question sometimes. People say, well, can a foreign seller do a 1031 exchange? Absolutely, foreign sellers can do 1031 exchanges, okay? Foreign sellers, that's like foreign entities, foreign individuals, okay? They don't file a U.S. tax return, okay? Foreign sellers are also going to be subject to an additional tax. It's referred to as FIRPTA, okay? That's an additional 15% tax. It's based off of the gross sales price, okay? The good news is when a foreign seller does a 1031 exchange, they can also get out of having to pay the additional 15% FIRPTA tax. Now, the way they get out of it is they can actually apply for a withholding certificate from the IRS, okay? To get this withholding certificate issued, it doesn't happen overnight. I think I have up in the slide, it takes like 6 weeks to get it done. I'm hearing now it takes even longer. It can take months and months to get the withholding certificate issued, all right? But it just takes the proper planning, okay? You need to have a tax ID number. If you don't, you have to apply for one. You have to complete the form requesting the withholding certificate, okay? Again, all of that takes time, all right? But it can be done. I have a great PDF that talks about this entire process, all right? Again, remember I mentioned some of the topics we're going to cover. I have in PDF form. I have one that just talks about this. I'm going to email that out to everybody that's on the line today, okay? Some of the other things that can affect FIRPTA, if the sales price is $300,000 or less, and the buyer is going to live in the property as their primary residence, there's no FIRPTA withholding. Now, if the sales price is $300,000 up to $1 million, and the buyer is going to live in it as their primary residence, there's only a 10% FIRPTA withholding. Now, if the sales price is $1 million or more, it doesn't matter what the buyer is going to do. If they're going to live in it as their primary or not, it's still the 15%. All right, so just keep that in mind as well. All right, now, related parties in 1031 exchanges. Boy, if you're going to do anything to do with a related party when it comes to 1031 exchange, you need to be really, really careful. Okay, related parties, that's like your wife, your wife, your spouse, your children, your grandparents. Okay, if you own 50% or more in an entity, that is also considered a related party. Okay, I list part of a form on the screen. That's part of IRS form 8824. That's the actual form that you complete or your CPA completes to report your 1031 exchange on your tax return, okay? There isn't a lot that they ask for on that IRS form 8824, but there's a section where they specifically ask, did you buy from a related party or did you sell to a related party? They're looking for that, all right? The IRS is looking for an arm's length transaction when it comes to 1031 exchange, okay? You can only buy from a related party if that party is also doing a 1031 exchange with no boot, and we're going to talk about what boot is in a minute, all right? And then each party is going to have to hold on to their respective properties for at least 2 years, right? You can only sell to a related party if that party holds on to the property for 2 years. So again, anything to do with related parties when it comes to 1031 exchange, boy, you need to dot every I and cross every T. All right, if they're looking for that information on that IRS form 8824, it could possibly be some type of red flag. It could also possibly trigger some type of audit. So just keep that in mind, anything to do with related parties, okay? All right, the most important slide of the day. I know we have a lot of realtors on the line today, but why is exchanging beneficial to you guys as realtors? Well, for one thing, with 1031 exchange, there's always going to be two transactions, all right? There's always going to be what we refer to as the relinquished property, the property being sold in a 1031 exchange, and there's always going to be a replacement property, the property that's being purchased in a 1031 exchange. So two transactions, two commissions, right? Now, one of the rules to 1031 exchange is the property that gets purchased in a 1031 exchange, that purchase price must be at least equal to, or it can even be greater than, whatever the sales price was on the property that was sold, the relinquished property. All right, so what does that mean for you guys as realtors? What that means is the commission that you're going to make on the replacement property, it's going to be as good, if not better, than what it was on the relinquished property, just because of that rule. All right. Now, the 1031 tax savings benefit, we've kind of already talked about that. Y'all think back to the slide we calculated what the taxes were, right? Remember that client sitting there thinking, hey, they're going to have to cut a check for $138,050, right? And whatever's left over, hey, now let's go find me some replacement property. Again, if you're the one that brings it to their attention, you can avoid having to cut that check or those checks, right, if they're subject to state taxes. It just gives them that much more buying power, right, to go out there and buy themselves a better property. Hey, hopefully it's going to be a higher dollar property. Hopefully it's going to also equate to higher income producing property for them. But what is that going to do for you as far as your commission goes? Hopefully you just increase your commission all by recommending a 1031 exchange. I tell you, sometimes we even see this. Sometimes the property that's being purchased in a 1031 exchange, okay, sometimes the seller of that property is also an investor, but guess what? They don't know anything about 1031 exchange. Now, hey, who knows? Maybe you have the opportunity to speak to that seller, talk to them about 1031 exchange. Who knows? Maybe you can pick up another transaction. Maybe you can help them go out and find a replacement property. All right. Now, y'all think about this for a minute. Any property out there that is non-owner occupied is a potential 1031 exchange candidate. Why? Because if they don't live in the property, they might be holding that property as an investment, right? There's databases that you guys can tap into to get those types of leads, right? There's one that I know of. It's actually referred to as List Source. Okay. Now, List Source is a product of CoreLogic. You probably have heard of CoreLogic. CoreLogic is a huge database company. All right. So they have a product called List Source. Now, within List Source, you can do searches by zip code, geographical area, subdivision, and so on. The results it'll actually give you the mailing address and it'll give you the property address. If those two addresses are different, you know they don't live in the property. You could target the actual mailing address to the actual owner of the property, because I tell you what, we see this all the time. Somebody will own an investment property, a rental property, right? And they've owned that thing for years, and they know if they ever sell it, they're going to be looking at a huge gain, and they're going to have to cut a check to the government. And you know what? They just don't want to cut that check. So what do? They just hold on to that property, not realizing they have any other options out there. Again, if you target the mailing address, target the owner of the property, say, look, you do have an option. You can do a 1031 exchange, defer your taxes, avoid having to cut that check. Now let's go out and find you something even better. I mean, who knows? They might be able to go from owning that one investment property, right? That one rental property. They do a 1031 exchange. If they have enough, they might be able to go out and buy two replacement investment properties. They just relying on just having that one income stream coming in every month, right? From one tenant, from one property. Now they do a 1031, they buy two replacement properties. They have two income streams. Hey, hopefully they have higher cash flow coming in. And you know what? If they lose one of those tenants, they still have some funds coming in because now they have another property. All right, now you could even target the actual property address, because who knows, maybe they have a tenant in the property that's looking to buy something. I mean, I don't know, maybe they're looking to buy that property that they lived in for all those years, but what? The owner was never willing to sell it to them, right? Now, here in Florida, realtors tell me within the MLS system that y'all use here in Florida, there's a few databases that you can get those same types of leads. There's one that's referred to as iMaps. There's another one that's referred to as Remind, okay? Also, depending on the county, some of the property appraisers' offices will let you do searches by absentee owners. People tell me with this iMaps program and also Remind, you can do searches by absentee owners. Absentee owners, they don't live in the properties. They might be holding them as an investment. All right. If anybody in the line works any of like resort type of communities, like, you know, here in Florida, in Central Florida, we have all the theme parks like Disney, Universal, SeaWorld, any communities like on the beaches, you know, the Gulf Coast, East Coast, West Coast. All right. There's absentee owners in all of those types of areas, right? They might be holding those properties for investment, right? If you've always thought, boy, I'd love to be able to get my foot in the door with investors, but how do I do it? Maybe 1031 exchange becomes a tool for you to go out there and target investors, right? You have those databases, learn how to use them, right? They're at your disposal. Learn how to use them. If you're trying to distinguish yourself from everybody else in the business, maybe 1031 exchange becomes a tool for you to go out there and target investors and hopefully increase your business. All right. So again, some things to think about for everybody on the line today, right? Now, What type of property is excluded from 1031 exchange? Well, your primary residence. We've already talked about that. You cannot do a 1031 exchange on your primary home, your primary residence, right? What may you be able to do? You might qualify for that section 121, right? But again, primary residences are excluded from 1031 exchange. Now, property held for sale is also excluded from 1031 exchange. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly does that mean? What's property held for sale? Well, I'll give you guys an example of maybe the way that could work. You know, here in Florida, we have a lot of these like national home builders, you know, like Pulte Homes, Lennar Homes, KB Homes. Let's say I'm Pulte Homes, right? Now, Pulte Homes is one of the largest single-family residential home builders in the entire country. You know, they're a publicly traded company. They build newly constructed properties, primary residential properties, all throughout the United States, right? When those properties are completed, what do they do with them? Well, they turn around and sell them, right? Well, because they're holding those properties for sale and not for investment, they can't do 1031 exchanges on those types of properties because property held for sale is excluded from 1031 exchange. Now, dealer property is also excluded from 1031 exchange. You might be asking yourself, what exactly is dealer property? Well, dealer property might be somebody that we most often refer to as a flipper. You know, they buy a property today, they fix that property up, maybe it takes them 2 or 3 months, right? And after the 2 or 3 months passes, when the property is completed, what do they do with it? They also turn around and sell it. You can't do 1031 exchanges on those types of properties because that's like their inventory. That's the business that they're in. They're in the business of buying properties, fixing them up when they're completed, turning around and selling them. You can't do 1031 exchanges on those types of properties. All right, now, here's a possible solution for a flipper. Again, let's say they buy a property today, right? I don't know, 2 or 3 months goes by, they fix the property up. But when it's completed, instead of them turning around and selling it, they go to their realtor and they say, hey, can you put this in the MLS system showing it for rent? And hey, let's make sure we put it in there for fair market value rent as well. That's a little bit different, right? Because now all of a sudden, what are they doing? They're showing that their intent is to hold the property for investment and not for sale. I mean, hey, who knows? Maybe they even show it to a potential renter. They run some type of credit check on that potential renter. They don't have such great credit. They decide not even to rent it to that potential renter. If that flipper ever gets audited and the IRS comes in and says, okay, prove to us you held that property for investment and not for sale, they're going to have to be able to back it up. In the example I gave you guys, there's a good shot they could. They could say, look, here's an email that I sent to my realtor on such and such a day, requesting that they put it in the MLS system for fair market value rent. Hey, here's the MLS listing showing it for fair market value rent. Here's the day I showed it to that potential renter. Here's the credit check I ran on that potential renter. All of that type of stuff is going to be what? It's going to be their proof, their backup that their intent was to hold the property for investment and not for sale. All right. But remember, everybody, if they buy a property today and however long it takes for them to fix it up, when it's completed, if they turn around and sell it, you can't do 1031 exchanges on those types of properties. All right. Now, foreign property is also excluded from 1031 exchange. I'll give you guys an example, I'll give you an example maybe the way that could work. So let's say I own an investment property here in Florida, right? Okay, I sell it in a 1031 exchange. Now, I can't try to go out and buy replacement property, let's say somewhere in Canada or Mexico or maybe like somewhere in Europe, okay? It has to be what? It has to be property located in the United States, including Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, or the Mariana Islands, all right? So foreign property is excluded from 1031 exchange, okay? Now, what are the tax deferral requirements? Well, in order to get a full deferral, to defer your taxes 100%, okay? Rule number one is you must reinvest all the net proceeds in property of equal or greater value. So you might be asking yourself, what exactly are the net proceeds? What does that mean? Well, that's the cash, right? That's the cash that normally you would get out of the closing, okay? Now, we're the QI, the qualified intermediary. We're going to hold those proceeds, the net proceeds from that sale, because the rule is the seller, the exchanger, can never actually have receipt of those funds, right? If they ever do, they would lose their ability to do a 1031 exchange, right? So they can't close today, call me tomorrow and say, hey, Jeff, I want to do a 1031 exchange. At that point, it's too late, right? They couldn't even close today, walk out of the door of the escrow company, title company, attorney's office, where they did the closing, okay? Get in their car in the parking lot and call me from the car and say, hey, Jeff, I want to do a 1031 exchange, right? Because that company that just did the closing, they might be holding their funds in their escrow account, waiting to wire the funds out to the client. At that point, the client has what's referred to as constructive receipt. They have a legal right to the funds. They've actually lost their ability to do a 1031 exchange, all right? So we have to get involved prior to the closing, basically prior to them walking out the door, all right? Now, what do they need to do with that entire amount? Back to the rule. They have to take that entire amount, the net proceeds, and use that entire amount towards purchasing a replacement property, or it can be multiple properties where the purchase price or the combined purchase prices, if they do elect to buy multiple properties, it has to be at least equal to, or it can even be greater than, whatever the sales price was on the property that they sold, the relinquished property. That's rule number one. Now, rule number two is, if they have debt, if they have a mortgage that they're paying off, a loan that they're paying off, right? Whatever that mortgage payoff amount is, you actually are required to obtain an equal amount of greater debt in the purchase of any replacement property or properties, okay? Now that rule can actually have an exception if you have cash that you're willing to use towards buying the replacement property. You can offset that rule. All right. Now, obviously, if you have no debt, if you don't have a mortgage, a loan that you're paying off, you're not required to obtain a loan in the purchase of any replacement property or properties, but you do have the option, if you need to or if you want to help you buy the replacement property. You always have that option. All right. How do the numbers work? Here's a quick example. All right. So let's just say we're going to sell our relinquished property. All right. Now we're going to sell it for $1 million. All right. Now we have some debt. We have a mortgage on the property, and the payoff amount is $300,000. Right. So we'll take that $1 million sales price, deduct out the payoff of $300,000. Now we're going to have some costs associated with that closing. All right. Let's just say that's going to be $50,000. That's going to be like, let's just say that's going to be like real estate commissions, title insurance, closing fees, some of those non-reoccurring type of fees. Let's just say that's $50,000. We'll deduct that out, and that's going to leave us with net proceeds of $650,000. Again, we're the QI, qualified intermediary. We're going to hold that $650,000 on behalf of the seller, the exchanger, right? Because they can never have receipt of those funds. Now, what are they going to do with that entire amount? Well, in this example, they're going to take that entire amount, that $650,000, and they're going to use that entire amount to go out and buy a replacement property for $1.2 million. They're actually going to buy a property of greater value than what they sold, right? Because they sold for $1 million, and the replacement property that they're purchasing is $1.2 million. If they do that, they just met rule number one, right? Because they're using all of the net proceeds. They're actually buying a property of greater value than what they sold. Now, they still need another $550,000 to help them buy that replacement property for $1.2 million. So what do they do in this case? They go out and get a loan for $550,000. Now, by getting a loan of $550,000, they actually just meet rule number two. Because why? Because they paid off a loan. The debt that they paid off was $300,000. And then the replacement property, they actually are acquiring greater debt than what they paid off, because the new loan is $550,000. If they do this, they'll get a full deferral. They'll defer their taxes 100%. Now, remember I told you with rule number two, you could actually, that could have an exception. If you have cash that you're willing to use towards buying the replacement property, you can offset that requirement. So let's just say they didn't want to get a loan for $550,000. Okay, well, what are their options at that point? Well, if they had cash of $550,000 that they were willing to use towards buying that replacement property, that would have worked for them. Or maybe they would have said this. Maybe they say, well, we do have some cash that we're willing to use towards buying the replacement property, and then the difference, we'll make that up in a mortgage or loan. That would have also worked for them, okay? What if they wanted to do this? What if out of that $650,000, they say, well, we don't want to use all of that towards buying a replacement property. We want to take 100,000 of that $650,000 and we want to hold that back, okay? And we only want to use $550,000 to help us buy the replacement property. You can do that with 1031 exchange, okay? But that $100,000 that you hold back, you're going to be subject to taxes on that amount, right? That's referred to as cash boot, all right? Doesn't mean that you can't do a 1031 exchange. It just means that instead of you getting a full deferral, you're going to get what's referred to as a partial deferral. Now, partial why? Because you're going to be paying some taxes on that $100,000 of cash boot, right? Typically, the taxes that you're going to pay on boot are going to be significantly less than if you just sell the property outright, all right? Now, that $100,000 that you hold back, you can do whatever you want with those funds. I mean, if you want to pay off bills, you want to go on a great vacation, maybe you have a child starting college, you want to pay for college. I mean, I don't know, you want to go to Vegas, you want to blow it all gambling. Again, whatever you want to do with that $100,000, you can, but just remember, you're going to be subject to taxes on that amount. All right, now back to the example. We're only going to hold $550,000 of that $650,000. Now, in this example, they're going to use that entire amount, the $550,000. They're going to use that and actually going to buy a property of less value than what they sold. They're going to go out and buy a property for $800,000. Now, they still need another $250,000 to help them do that. So what do they do in this case? They go out and get a loan for $250,000. But by only getting a loan for $250,000, what just happened? They actually went down in debt by $50,000, right? Because the loan that they paid off, that payoff amount was $300,000, and the replacement loan was $250,000. So they actually acquired $50,000 of less debt. They also are going to be subject to taxes on that amount, right? That amount is referred to as mortgage boot, right? So there's two types of boot. There's mortgage boot and there's cash boot. Again, doesn't mean you can't do a 1031 exchange. It just means that instead of you getting a full deferral, you're going to get what's referred to as a partial deferral. Now, partial why? Because you're going to be paying some taxes on the boot, all right? If anybody ever wants to do anything like this, boy, I always tell them, I say, look, you really need to sit down with your CPA and you have to look at all your numbers, right? Because basically you have to look at it two ways. You have to say, okay, if I just sell the property outright, I don't try to do any type of 1031 exchange, okay, what do my taxes look like? Now, if I do a 1031 exchange, but I pay some taxes on boot, what do my taxes look like? Right now, if the CPA comes back and says, well, the taxes that you're going to pay on boot are going to be significantly less, then move forward with a 1031 exchange. But if the CPA comes back and says the taxes that you're going to pay on boot, well, they're going to be about the same, or in some cases, they might even be greater than if you just sell the property outright, then it's probably a really easy decision for you. Don't do a 1031 exchange. You're going to lose money. All right. So again, always talk to your CPA. Make sure you know your numbers before you do anything. Okay. Now, there's actually some timelines associated with 1031 exchange that everyone needs to be aware of. Okay. So from when you sell your relinquished property, from the closing date, all right, from that day forward, you're going to have 180 calendar days to purchase any replacement property or properties, all right? And it's calendar days, it's holidays, it's weekends, okay? Hey, I live in Florida. From June 1st to November 30th is what? It's hurricane season, all right? If we're getting hit with a hurricane and everything's shutting down for a day or two or a week, whatever it may be, none of that matters with 1031 exchange, right? That clock is always going to be ticking. So please, everyone, keep that in mind, all right? Now, the first 45 days of the 180 days is what's referred to as the identification ID period. Basically, what that means is you must identify any potential property or properties you want to buy. Now, none of those properties even need to be under contract. You just have to identify any potential properties you want to buy. That's something else that we're going to assist with, right? We're going to provide to the client a form. Now, we refer to it as the identification ID letter. Basically, it's going to have some blank lines on it, but it's going to have to be specific to a property address or addresses. Client's going to have to fill that out, sign it, get it back to us by midnight of the 45th day. That's how they will formally identify their replacement property. They're going to do it to us, the qualified intermediary, the QI. All right. Here's the thing about the 45 days. Let's just say they happen to find that perfect property, but it's day 46. At that point, it's too late for them. All right. So whatever they put on that form by midnight of the 45th day, they're going to have to make sure they're going to be able to purchase at least one of those properties, and they have to purchase it by day 180. All right. There is no extensions to either one of the timelines. There is no exceptions to what you identify. I mean, if you identify, let's say, 3 properties, you complete the form, you get it back to us by midnight of the 45th day. If after midnight of the 45th day, let's say one of those properties that you identified, one of those properties sells, there's no going back and saying, hey, one of those properties I just identified on the form, that property just sold. There's no way in the world I could ever buy it now. It doesn't matter. You'd only have the opportunity to purchase those 2 other properties that you would identify. So again, there is no extensions to the timelines. There is no exceptions to what you identify after midnight of the 45th day. All right, so keep that in mind. Now, there's actually some rules to identifying. There's 3 different rules. All right, now I'm going to read each one of the rules to you. And if you don't quite understand them, don't worry about it, all right? Because I'm going to walk you through the numbers of how the rules work. And hopefully, once I show you the examples how the numbers work, it'll make sense to you. Now, the most popular rule that we see investors enacting, it's referred to as the 3-property rule. And the 3-property rule states this: you can identify up to 3 properties without regard to the fair market value of those 3 properties. So what exactly does that mean, right? Fair market value. Well, if you identify 3 properties or less, the purchase prices of any of those properties that you identified, they can be any dollar amount. It doesn't matter as long as you identify 3 properties or less. All right. Now, if you want to identify more than 3 properties, you can do that as well, but it's going to put you into this next rule. It's referred to as the 200% rule. And the 200% rule states this: you can identify over 3 properties, but you cannot exceed 200% or 2 times the combined fair market value of the property being sold. So what exactly does that mean, right? Well, if you identify more than 3 properties, the combined purchase prices for all those properties that you identified cannot exceed 200% or 2 times whatever the sales price was on the property that you sold, the relinquished property, all right? Now, if you want to exceed the 3-property rule and you also want to exceed the 200% rule, you can do that as well, but it's going to put you into this next rule. It's referred to as the 95% rule. Now, it's very rare that we even see this rule enacted, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense in the way that it's written, but remember, everybody, this is the IRS, and sometimes this stuff just doesn't make sense, right? Because it reads like this: you can identify over 3 properties. You can exceed the 200% rule, but you must acquire at least 95% of the value of all the properties that you identified. I get it. I know that's probably about as clear as mud, right? Let me show you other examples, especially with the 95% rule. And hopefully, once I walk you through the examples of how the numbers work, it'll make sense to you. All right, so here we go. All right, so here's the 3-property rule. Again, if you identify 3 properties or less, the purchase prices can be any dollar amount. It doesn't matter as long as you identify 3 properties or less. All right, so here's a quick example. Let's say we sell our property for $1 million. Now we go out, we identify 3 properties, all right, because we identified 3 properties, we're in the 3-property rule. Let's keep the numbers really simple. Let's say we're going to be buying each one of these properties for $1 million each. All right, so how much have we identified in property? $3 million worth of property, right? Because again, because we're in the 3-property rule, those purchase prices can be any dollar amount. It does not matter as long as we identify 3 properties or less. I mean, those purchase prices could be, I don't know, $10 million each for a total of $30 million in identification. Again, it doesn't matter as long as it's 3 properties or less. But what does matter? I'll say it again. If you identify 3 properties, boy, you better make sure you're going to be able to purchase at least one of those properties. So, what's the best way to lock up a property? it's really to put one of them under contract. Now, again, you're not required to have any of these properties that you identify under contract, but in practice, what we typically see investors doing is they will put one property under contract. That's one of the properties they identify. Then I don't know, maybe they'll identify two other properties just as backup, because what could potentially happen is after midnight of the 45th day, if the property that they do have under contract, if that whole deal falls apart, well, at least they'd have the opportunity to purchase those two other properties that they would have identified, right? So again, that's the three property rule. Hope everybody gets it. Now, here's the 200% rule. Okay, this is where you exceed the three property rule, but you cannot exceed 200% of two times the combined fair market value of the property being sold. All right, so here's how it works. Again, we sell for $1 million. Now, in this particular example, we go out and we identify 5 properties. All right, because we've identified 5 properties, what just happened? We exceeded that 3 property rule. So that's going to put us into the 200% rule. So what does that mean exactly? Well, what that means is the combined purchase prices for all 5 of those properties cannot exceed $2 million. Now, you might be asking yourself, where's he getting the $2 million from, right? Well, we sold for $1 million, right? So 200% of that $1 million sales price, or 2 times that $1 million sales price, is how much? $2 million, right? So I think this one is pretty straightforward. Hopefully everybody gets it. All right, now here's the 95% rule. Okay, again, this is where you exceed the 3 property rule, you exceed the 200% rule, but you must acquire at least 95% of the value of all the properties that you identified. All right, here's how it works. Again, we sell for $1 million. Now, in this example, we actually go out and we identify 10 properties. All right, because we've identified 10 properties, what just happened? We exceeded that 3 property rule, right? Now, let's keep the math simple on this one as well. Let's say we're going to buy each one of these properties for $1 million each. Okay, well, how much have we identified in property? $10 million worth of property, right? Because we've identified $10 million worth of property, what just happened there? We exceeded our 200% rule, right? Because that was $2 million. So that's going to put us into the 95% rule. So let's just say in this example, we're only able to purchase 9 out of the 10 properties that we identified. Well, that's only going to be 90%, or $9 million. That is not 95%, right? If we do that, if we're only able to purchase 9 out of the 10 properties that we identified, guess what's going to happen? We're going to blow our entire exchange, and we're going to be subject to having to pay all of the taxes, all right? So in practice, really the way the 95% rule works, it's really going to be 100% of whatever you identify, you're going to have to buy. And you know what? We're using really simple numbers. We're saying, hey, each one of those purchase prices are going to be $1 million each. In the real world, those purchase prices are going to be all over the map, right? It's going to be really hard to sit down and say, okay, let's see. If I buy this property, wait, that's only going to put me at 93%. Okay, let's see. Maybe I need to make sure I purchase this other property. Oh, that's only going to put me at 94%. Again, in practice, the way the 95% rule works, it's really going to be 100% of whatever you identify, you're going to have to buy. All right, the IRS wants to limit you in how many properties you can identify. You know, they don't want you going out there identifying everything under the sun, because you know what's going to happen if you identify everything under the sun? You're ultimately going to have to purchase everything under the sun because this crazy 95% rule. Again, we don't see it enacted that often, but just realize it does exist and it is out there, okay? Now, how does the whole closing process work when it comes to 1031 exchange? Well, we don't even get the process started until there's a contract on the property being sold, the relinquished property, right? Because the way the process starts is I would need to get a copy of the contract, right? I'd also need to get the contact information for the person that's handling the closing, and obviously along with the contact information for the sellers, right? Once we have that in hand, a copy of the contract, we're actually going to reach out to whoever's handling the closing. It might be an escrow company, title company, attorney, whatever's handling the closing. And what we're going to get from them is a copy of the title search, the title commitment. Some parts of the country call it the title binder, the preliminary, all right? Basically, it's a search of the title, all right? Once we have that in hand along with the contract, then what we're going to do is we're going to prepare what we refer to as an exchange agreement, right? That'll be documents that will set up the 1031 exchange. We're going to email those over to whoever's going to be handling the closing. Those documents will sit there waiting for the closing to happen, okay? Day of closing, client's going to go in, they're going to sign those documents. Again, when they sign those documents, that'll set up their 1031 exchange. But also, when they sign those documents, that's going to give us the ability to step into their shoes as the seller, all right? That's also going to give whoever's handling the closing the ability to take those net proceeds from that sale. They're going to wire those net proceeds over to us. We're going to hold them on behalf of the seller, the exchanger, all right? That transaction takes place, and then what happens? The clock starts ticking, right? 180 days to close. The first 45 days of the 180 is the identification ID period. We're going to be sending out that identification ID letter. Client's going to fill it out, sign it, get it back to us by midnight of the 45th day. Now, once they get one of those properties under contract that they identified, we'll need to get a copy of that contract as well. And just like on their sale, we needed the contact information for the person that would be handling their closing, it's going to be the same thing for their purchase. Because, you know, just think about it. We're going to be holding all their funds, right? We're going to need to get a contact person. We're going to need to get from that company their wiring instructions. We're going to prepare some other documents. We'll send over to that company. Those documents will sit there waiting for that closing to happen. Day of closing, client's going to go in. They'll sign those documents. Now, when they sign those documents, that's going to give us the ability to step into their shoes as the buyer. That's also going to give us the ability to take the proceeds that we would have been holding from their sale. We're going to wire those proceeds over to whoever's going to be handling the closing to help them purchase their replacement property. That's it. That's how the whole closing process works. It's not really that complicated of a process when it comes to the actual closings, right? Just it's the more complicated stuff is what you see day in and day out in the real estate world. You know, negotiating contracts, getting a pre-approval for a loan. Yeah, you know, the 45 days, that can be a little tricky sometimes, but when it comes to the actual closing process, that's probably the easier part of 1031 exchange, okay? Now, there's a few different type of 1031 exchanges. The most common type of exchange that we do, probably 90 to 95% of all the exchanges we do, is referred to as a delayed exchange. Another term you hear people refer to it as a forward exchange, okay? And it's everything that we've talked about today. It's where you sell first, you sell your relinquished property first, and then you buy last. You're buying that replacement property by when? You're buying it by day 180, all right? Again, the most common type of exchange we do, you know, day in and day out is a delayed exchange. But there's another type of exchange it's referred to as a reverse exchange. And it works just the opposite of a delayed exchange. It actually gives you the ability to buy first, to buy your replacement property first, and then sell last, okay? The thing with exchanging is you can't exchange into something you already own. So what typically happens in the reverse exchange is, let's say somebody has their property listed for sale. Now, maybe they don't even have it under contract yet, but they go out and boy, they find that perfect replacement property. And they know if they don't act fast, they're going to lose out on being able to purchase that perfect replacement property because, hey, maybe it's a seller's market, right? Properties are turning over really quickly. And they know, boy, if I don't act fast, by the time I sell my relinquished property, that perfect replacement property, it may no longer be available. It may be sold. So what can they do to save that whole deal? They can do this thing called the reverse exchange. And what happens in the reverse exchange is we actually come in and we form a separate entity. It's referred to as an exchange accommodation title holder, EAT for short, okay? We come in and we buy the replacement property, okay? Now, from when we purchase the replacement property, you must be able to sell your relinquished property within 180 days, all right? So there's the 180 coming back into play. It's always going to be around in some form or fashion with any type of 1031 exchange. What are some of the positives for a reverse exchange? Well, as I mentioned, in a seller's market, you find the perfect replacement property, you got to act fast. How do you save that whole deal? Do the reverse exchange. Now, sometimes we see this, and some of y'all may have had a client like this in the past. You might have a client like this right now. They list their property with you, right? and they think, boy, my property is the greatest property in the world. I'm not going to have any problem selling it, right? So what do? They go out and put a contract on a replacement property, right? And then slowly but surely, what happens? Reality starts to set in, right? They realize maybe I don't have the world's greatest property because I'm not getting all those showings like I thought I was going to get. I'm not getting all those offers like I thought I was going to get. But guess what? They already have a contract on a replacement property, and that closing date is fast approaching. They're obligated to buy that property. How can they save that whole deal? They can do the reverse exchange, okay? What's the biggest obstacle to overcome? The biggest negative? Well, it's the financial part. You know, we're a great company, but we're not just going to come out of pocket and buy the replacement property. The client is going to have to be able to give us the financing in order for us to do that. Typically, it's going to have to be cash. Now, why do I say cash? Because, you know, if they're trying to get some type of loan or mortgage, typically lenders will not loan funds at that point because, hey, we're not the borrower, the client is. We're actually going on title, the client is not. So that's why I say typically it's going to have to be cash. Now, hey, I don't know, maybe they have some type of great banking relationship. They get some type of line of credit. You know, some people tell me some of these like hard money type lenders, and the other do deals like that all day long. For us, it doesn't really matter. Just some way, somehow, the client is going to have to be able to give us the financing in order for us to purchase the replacement property. All right. Now, what's the other obstacle? Well, I kind of already mentioned it. You have to be able to sell your relinquished property within 180 days. What if you don't do that? Well, what happens is come day 181, you're going to own another property. Now, you're not going to have any capital gains taxes or anything like that to pay because why? Because you never sold anything. Now, the client might sit there and say, well, you know what? I still want to sell this investment property. No problem. You can do that. You can do a 1031 exchange. But guess what? You're going to have to designate a new replacement property because the original replacement property, you're already going to own it. And as I mentioned, with 1031 exchange, you can't exchange it to something you already own. All right, so that's how the reverse exchange works. Now, there's another type of exchange. It's referred to as a construction exchange. Another term you hear people refer to it is an improvement exchange or even a built-to-suit exchange. They can work something like this. All right, let's say you sell your relinquished property, right? You sell it in a 1031 exchange. We're the QI, right? Qualified intermediary. We're going to be holding the proceeds from that sale. Client goes out, they find a replacement property, but they want to do some improvements to it before they actually purchase it. Well, what can you do in that case? Well, you can do this thing called the construction improvement built-to-suit exchange. We again come in, we form that EAT. We can take the proceeds that we're holding from this sale, we use those proceeds, and then we buy the replacement property, all right? And then we oversee any improvements. Now, we're working hand in hand with the client, but any type of payments that need to go out, disbursements to like contractors, subcontractors, we handle all of that, all right? Now, those improvements need to be done within 180 days, okay? Again, there's the 180 coming back into play. As I mentioned, it's always going to be around in some form or fashion. It never leaves, okay, in any type of 1031 exchange. Now, there's another type of exchange. Now, I personally refer to it as a non-appreciation exchange, okay? They could possibly work something like this. Let's say you have a client, and your client tells you, they say, look, you know, this property that I'm selling, this investment property, I purchased it in the height of the market. Let's say they tell you, I purchased it for $1 million. Now, I've owned the property for years, and I'm going to sell it for $1 million. So on the surface, the client looks at that and they say, well, I bought it for $1 million. I'm selling it for $1 million. Hey, I have no gain. There's no reason to do any type of 1031 exchange, right? Well, you remember depreciation recapture tax? Remember that 25% tax we talked about earlier in the presentation? Let's just say that particular property, that client took $200,000 worth of depreciation for the lifetime that they've owned that property. So what's going to happen when they go to sell the property, they're going to be hit with that 25% depreciation recapture tax on that $200,000 worth of depreciation. That's going to equate to $50,000 in depreciation recapture tax that they're going to have to pay when they sell that property. They can still do a 1031 exchange and defer the depreciation recapture tax, right? So if you ever have a client that's telling you something similar, just ask them, say, look, have you talked to your CPA? Do you know all your numbers, right? Because you don't want them to be in for a shock not realizing, hey, I could have done a 1031 exchange, deferred the depreciation and recapture tax, but they just didn't know any better. All right. What's another red flag? If you ever have a client that tells you, hey, this investment property that I'm selling, I purchased it in the 1031 exchange, but you know what? I'm not going to do any type of 1031 on the sale of this. That should be a red flag too, because remember, 1031 exchange is a tax deferral. It's not a tax avoidance. Any 1031 exchanges they did up until that point, they could also be subject to having to pay those taxes that they deferred. All right. Now, what do we charge for our services? What's our fee? Well, again, the most common type of exchange that we do is a delayed exchange. All right. It's where you sell first, you sell your relinquished property first, and you buy last. You're buying that replacement property by day 180. All right. We charge a flat $1,250, $1,250. Now, we don't collect any type of setup fees. We don't charge any type of wiring fees. I just walked y'all through the entire closing process. We like to get everything started when a contract gets signed for the relinquished property, the property being sold. We prepare that exchange agreement. We send that over to the company handling the closing, waiting for the closing to happen. If the closing never happens, right? If the contract falls apart, the buyer walks, or the client, the seller, decides at the very last minute, they say, well, we've had second thoughts, we're not going to move forward with any type of 1031 exchange. We don't even charge any type of cancellation fees. All right, our $1,250, our fee is not incurred until the day of closing. All right, just like you guys as realtors, right? You don't earn any type of commission until the file closes. Our fee is not incurred until the day of closing. And the good news with our fee is it covers the sale of one relinquished property and actually the purchase of up to 3 replacement properties. That's it. There's no other hidden costs, hidden fees, anything like that. All right, now, the reverse exchange. Again, that's what you buy first. You buy the replacement property first, and you sell last. You're selling that replacement property by day 180. Those types of exchanges can be significantly more complicated. We're forming a separate company. We're going on title, okay? Those types of exchanges, they start off at $8,500, right? Same thing with the construction exchange, improvement exchange, or built-to-suit exchanges. Those can be significantly more complicated than a delayed exchange. We're forming a separate company. We're going on title. We're working with contractors, okay? Those also start off at $8,500. Remember, I told you all in the very beginning, one of the owners of our company is a tax attorney, Adam Skarsgård. Adam personally handles any reverse exchanges, construction, improvement, or built-to-suit exchanges that we do because of their complexities, right? He looks at each one of them individually, figures out how complex they are, bases our fee off of the complexity, but they start off at $8,500, okay? Now, we're doing great on time. I'm going to go ahead and open the floor up to questions. All right, if you have any questions, there's a box that says questions. Feel free, type your questions in. All right, as we're waiting for questions to come in, I'll remind everybody, today's presentation was recorded. You're going to receive a link to today's recording if you want to refer back to any of the topics that we're going to discuss, okay? Some of the topics that we discussed today, I mentioned here and there, having just single-page PDF form. I have ones that are more general in nature. I'm going to email those out to everybody on the line today. All right. Some of the information I even have in Spanish and Chinese. If you want those additional languages, please let me know. All right. You don't have to go about this alone. All right. I want to be a resource for everybody on the line today. All right. If you have clients that have 1031 exchange questions or needs, or individually, if you're an investor, if you have questions or needs, please let me know. My contact information is up on the screen. That's my office line along with my email. Please send me an email, shoot, or give me a call. I'd be glad to talk to you or your clients, okay? You don't have to be a 1031 exchange expert after today. I talk to people about 1031 exchange all day long, all right? And as I mentioned in the very beginning, if you're a Florida realtor, okay, today's class was worth 2 continuing education hours. If you did not give me your Florida real estate license number when you registered, please email it to me, all right? I also need the SL or BK because, as I mentioned, in the beginning, it's a manual process. I have to take your first and last name along with your Florida real estate license number, SL or BK, upload that to the state, all right? I should be able to get all that done by the end of this week for you. So what happens is once I upload it to the Florida DBPR site, I'll get a confirmation that it was posted to your account. You should be able to go right into your online account with the Florida DBPR, check to see if your hours have been posted. All right, but just give me a little time because again, it's a manual process, and not everybody gives me their license number in the when they register. All right, so bear with me. Today's class was obviously a 2-hour class. I do have other classes that I teach. I have a 1-hour basics class. It's non-CE. I also have an advanced class, kind of a continuation of the basics. That's an hour and 15 minutes, and then I have this class. A lot of my classes I do for real estate offices, boards of realtors, title companies, attorneys' offices. If you think other people in your office, staff or members in your office, realtors, if you think, hey, it'd be great if you can come in and do a class just for us, let me know. All right, I got some information about the classes. Can email it over to you. If you're the decision maker, or if you have to forward it on to the powers that be, just let me know. I'll get those over to you.